The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the East Valley Martial Arts Academy, casting harsh shadows across the training mats. Sarah Martinez adjusted her plain black gi, the fabric worn soft from countless training sessions. At 28, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that most people mistook for shyness. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her calloused hands spoke of years dedicated to combat training, though few would guess the true extent of her experience. The dojo was packed that Tuesday evening. Word had spread through the local martial arts community about the visiting master, Takeshi Nakamura, a renowned sixth-degree black belt from Tokyo who was conducting a special seminar. Nakamura had built his reputation not just on technical skill, but on his ability to read fighters, to spot weaknesses in their stance, their breathing, their very presence on the mat. Sarah had arrived early, claiming a spot near the back of the room. She preferred to observe before engaging, a habit ingrained through years of missions where patience meant the difference between success and catastrophe. Around her, dozens of martial artists from various disciplines had gathered. Black belts, brown belts, and eager students all waited to learn from the master. Nakamura entered with the bearing of a man accustomed to respect. His black belt was pristine, the gold embroidery catching the light as he moved. He was in his early 50s, with graying hair and the lean build of someone who had dedicated his life to the martial arts. His eyes swept the room, cataloging each participant with the precision of a predator assessing potential threats. The seminar began with traditional warm-ups and basic techniques. Nakamura demonstrated combinations with fluid precision, each movement economical and devastating. Sarah followed along, her techniques clean but unremarkable to the casual observer. She deliberately kept her speed moderate, her strikes controlled. Years of covert operations had taught her the value of appearing ordinary. As the evening progressed, Nakamura began calling students forward for demonstration purposes. He would show a technique, then invite someone to attack him so he could display its practical application. Each volunteer was systematically dismantled with embarrassing ease. The master's commentary was sharp, sometimes cutting, as he pointed out flaws in their approach. Martial arts is not about collecting belts, Nakamura announced to the gathered students. It is about understanding violence, about reading your opponent's intentions before they act. Most of you fight with your muscles when you should fight with your mind. During a brief water break, Sarah noticed a group of younger black belts huddled near the front of the room. Their leader was Jake Morrison, a 24-year-old who had earned his black belt in record time at a local McDojo. Jake was the type who collected martial arts ranks like trophies, switching between styles whenever progress slowed. His gi was immaculate, adorned with patches from various tournaments and organizations. "Did you see how Master Nakamura handled Thompson?" Jake was saying to his friends, referring to a brown belt who had been thoroughly dominated during a demonstration. "Guy thought he was tough because he does MMA on weekends. Master showed him what real martial arts looks like." One of Jake's companions, a stocky man named Derek, nodded enthusiastically. "That's the problem with these weekend warriors. They think they can just walk in here and compete with people who've been doing this their whole lives." Sarah continued stretching, but her attention was drawn to their conversation. She had encountered many fighters like Jake during her military career. Skilled technicians who confused technique with combat effectiveness. Men who had never faced genuine life or death situations. "I bet half the people in here couldn't handle themselves in a real fight," Jake continued, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "Especially some of these newer students. Like that woman in the back there." He gestured casually towards Sarah. "Probably took up karate for fitness or self-defense classes. Thinks she's ready to train with serious martial artists." Derek laughed. "Yeah, she looks like she'd run at the first sign of real contact. Probably never been in a real fight in her life." Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. In the past 18 months alone, she had participated in 7 classified operations across 3 continents. She had engaged in hand-to-hand combat with terrorists, drug cartel enforcers, and enemy combatants in environments where hesitation meant death. The irony of being dismissed by these weekend warriors was not lost on her. The break ended, and Nakamura called the group back to attention. Now we will practice more advanced applications, he announced. I need volunteers who believe they understand true combat. Jake's hand shot up immediately. Master Nakamura, I'd be honored to demonstrate with you. Do. Nakamura studied him for a moment, then nodded. Very well. Attack me however you choose. What followed was a clinical dismantling. Jake launched into a series of well-practiced combinations, his technique textbook perfect, but Nakamura flowed around his attacks like water, redirecting Jake's momentum and sending him tumbling across the mat repeatedly. Within 30 seconds, Jake was breathing heavily, his perfect uniform disheveled. Technique without understanding is merely choreography, Nakamura observed as Jake struggled to his feet. You fight like you are performing for judges, not defending your life. Jake's face flushed with embarrassment as nervous laughter rippled through the watching students. He had been completely outclassed, and everyone had witnessed it. As he returned to his spot, Sarah could see the wounded pride in his eyes, the desperate need to restore his image. The problem with many American martial artists, Nakamura continued, is that you have never faced true violence. You practice in climate-controlled rooms with rules and referees. Real combat is chaos. It is dirty, desperate, and decided in seconds. Jake raised his hand again. Master, with respect, some of us have competed at high levels. We understand pressure and violence. Nakamura's expression grew cold. Competition is not combat, young man. In competition, your opponent wants to defeat you. In combat, your opponent wants to kill you. The difference is everything. The master's eyes swept the room again, looking for someone who might prove his point. His gaze lingered on several of the more advanced students before settling on an unexpected target. You, he said, pointing directly at Sarah. Sarah felt every eye in the room turn toward her. She had hoped to remain invisible throughout the seminar, to learn without drawing attention. But now she found herself the focus of 60 pairs of curious eyes, including Jake's smirking gaze. Me, sir? Sarah asked, though she was already moving toward the center of the mat. Yes. I want to demonstrate something to these young competitors. They believe that belt rank and tournament trophies indicate fighting ability. You appear to be someone without such pretensions. As Sarah approached, Jake leaned over to Derek. This should be good. Master's about to show everyone what happens when amateurs step up. Sarah reached the center of the mat and bowed respectfully to Nakamura. Up close, she could see the intelligence in his eyes, the way he was studying her posture, her breathing, her general demeanor. She kept her expression neutral, but internally she was calculating. How much should she reveal? How hard could she push without exposing her true background? I want you to attack me, Nakamura instructed. Do not hold back. Show these students what you believe combat looks like. Sarah hesitated for just a moment. Around the edge of the mat, she could hear Jake making quiet comments to his friends about what was about to happen to the weekend warrior. The condescension in his voice triggered something deep within her, a competitive fire that had been forged in the crucible of actual warfare. Are you certain, Master? She asked quietly. I would not want to. I am quite certain, Nakamura interrupted. Please, show us your understanding of violence. Sarah nodded and shifted into a ready stance. To most observers, her posture looked competent, but unremarkable. Jake snorted quietly, already anticipating her defeat. What none of them could see was the subtle shift in Sarah's eyes, the way her breathing changed, or the almost imperceptible adjustment in her center of gravity that transformed her from a casual practitioner into something far more dangerous. The transformation was so complete that even Nakamura, for all his experience, failed to recognize it until it was too late. When Sarah moved, it was not with the measured techniques of a dojo warrior, but with the lightning-fast precision of someone who had learned to fight in places where hesitation meant death. Her first strike, a seemingly simple jab, cut through Nakamura's guard like a blade through paper. Before he could process what had happened, Sarah had stepped inside his reach, her elbow driving toward his solar plexus with enough force to drop a grown man. Only Nakamura's extraordinary reflexes allowed him to partially deflect the blow, but even so, the impact sent him stumbling backward. The dojo fell silent. In 30 years of teaching, Nakamura had never been caught so completely off guard. Sarah pressed her advantage, flowing into a series of combinations that blended multiple martial arts with battlefield-tested techniques. Her movements were economical, brutal, and terrifyingly effective. But what truly stunned the watching martial artists was not just the skill of her attacks, but the complete absence of wasted motion. Every strike had a purpose. Every step was calculated for maximum efficiency. This was not the fighting of someone who had learned in a dojo, but the combat methodology of someone who had killed with their bare hands. Nakamura, to his credit, began to adapt. His decades of experience allowed him to read Sarah's patterns and begin mounting a defense. But by then, the damage to his reputation was done. The woman he had selected to demonstrate on had not only survived his assault but had clearly gotten the better of the exchange. The sparring session lasted only 45 seconds. But those 45 seconds shattered every assumption the dojo had made about Sarah Martinez. When they finally separated, both breathing hard, the silence in the room was deafening. Jake's mouth hung open in disbelief. The woman he had dismissed as a weekend warrior had just dominated one of the most respected martial artists in the world. His friends looked equally stunned, their earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. Nakamura straightened his gi and bowed deeply to Sarah, a gesture of profound respect that was not lost on anyone present. "Thank you for the lesson," he said quietly. "I apologize for underestimating you." Sarah returned the bow, her breathing already returning to normal. "Thank you for the opportunity to train, Master." As she turned to walk back to her position, Jake stepped forward. His pride demanded some kind of response, some way to restore the natural order that had been so violently disrupted. "That was impressive," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "But Master Nakamura is older, and he wasn't expecting serious contact. I'd be interested to see how you'd handle someone closer to your own age and experience level." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Sarah turned back, her expression still neutral, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. She had spent the last 7 years of her life in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, facing enemies who wanted nothing more than to see her dead. The idea of being challenged by this dojo warrior was almost absurd. "Are you issuing a challenge?" she asked quietly. Jake's chest puffed out with false confidence. "If you're willing to accept one. Unless you think that little demonstration was just a lucky break." Around the room, students began to murmur with excitement. This was the kind of drama that would be talked about for months. Sarah looked at Jake for a long moment, taking in his perfect uniform, his carefully maintained appearance, his need to prove himself in front of his peers. "Very well," she said simply. "I accept your challenge." The atmosphere in the dojo shifted dramatically as Sarah and Jake faced each other on the center mat. What had begun as a routine training seminar had transformed into something much more significant. Students pressed closer to the edges of the mat, their conversations dropping to hushed whispers. Even Master Nakamura, still processing his own surprising encounter with Sarah, watched with intense curiosity. Jake rolled his shoulders and cracked his knuckles, a display of confidence that fooled no one who truly understood combat. His friends gathered behind him, offering encouragement that sounded increasingly hollow in the charged atmosphere. Derek clapped him on the shoulder and whispered something about showing the newcomer her place. Sarah, meanwhile, stood perfectly still. Her breathing was controlled, her posture relaxed but ready. To an untrained observer, she might have appeared nervous or even frightened, but those with real experience in violence could see the predatory stillness that had settled over her, the way her eyes had taken on the flat, calculating expression of a professional killer. "Standard dojo rules," Jake announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Light contact only. No strikes to the head or joints. We're martial artists, not street fighters." Sarah tilted her head slightly, a gesture so small that most missed it entirely. "Of course," she replied quietly. Light contact. Master Nakamura stepped forward to officiate, though his role had shifted from teacher to referee. Begin when ready, he announced, then quickly moved out of range. Jake wasted no time establishing what he believed would be his dominance. He launched into a series of flashy kicks, the kind that looked impressive in tournaments and demonstration videos. His technique was undeniably clean, his form textbook perfect. Each movement flowed into the next, with the precision of countless hours of practice, in front of mirrors and sympathetic training partners. But Sarah moved like smoke. Every kick that should have connected found only empty air. Every punch that should have landed was met with a redirect so subtle that Jake couldn't understand why his attacks were failing. She wasn't blocking his techniques so much as making them irrelevant, flowing around his aggression like water around stones. After 30 seconds of mounting frustration, Jake attempted a spinning heel kick that would have been devastating had it connected. Sarah stepped inside the arc of his leg, too close for the technique to be effective, and suddenly Jake found himself off balance and overextended. Sarah's response was immediate and clinical. Her palm strike to his solar plexus was perfectly controlled, delivering just enough force to drive the wind from his lungs without causing lasting damage. As Jake doubled over, gasping, Sarah flowed into a takedown that sent him tumbling across the mat. The entire sequence lasted less than 3 seconds. Jake scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment and growing anger. His perfect uniform was now wrinkled and dusty, his carefully maintained appearance destroyed in front of his peers. The whispers from the watching students had taken on a different tone, shifting from anticipation to amazement. "Lucky shot," Jake muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. "Won't happen again." He approached more cautiously this time, using his reach advantage to probe with jabs and low kicks. Sarah allowed him to establish a rhythm, seemingly content to defend and counter. But those watching closely could see that she was studying him, cataloging his patterns and preferences with the methodical precision of a scientist analyzing a specimen. Jake's confidence began to return as he landed several light strikes. Sarah absorbed them without apparent difficulty, but Jake interpreted her defensive posture as a sign that he was gaining the upper hand. He began to press forward more aggressively, combining his strikes into longer combinations. That's when Sarah chose to demonstrate the difference between dojo sparring and real combat. Jake threw a right cross that he was particularly proud of, a technique that had won him several tournament bouts. Sarah's counter was so fast that most of the watching students missed it entirely. She slipped the punch by mere inches, stepped into Jake's guard, and delivered what appeared to be a gentle push to his chest. Jake flew backward as if he had been hit by a truck. The force of Sarah's palm strike, applied with perfect timing and leverage, sent him sprawling across the mat with enough force that he slid several feet before coming to rest against the far wall. The impact knocked over a rack of training equipment with a tremendous crash that echoed through the suddenly silent dojo. For a moment, nobody moved. Jake lay stunned against the wall, trying to process what had just happened. The push had felt like being hit by a car. Despite appearing almost casual to observers, Sarah stood in the center of the mat, her expression unchanged, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Derek was the first to react, rushing to help his friend to his feet. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, rounding on Sarah. "That wasn't light contact." Sarah looked at him with the same flat expression she had given Jake. "He's uninjured," she replied simply. That was light contact. Jake pushed Derek away and struggled to his feet, his pride wounded more than his body. The watching students were now openly discussing what they had witnessed, their voices filled with excitement and disbelief. Several were already pulling out phones to record what was clearly becoming a legendary encounter. "Again," Jake said through gritted teeth. "That was a fluke." Master Nakamura stepped forward. "Perhaps we should... again," Jake repeated, cutting off the master's attempt to end the demonstration. His need to restore his reputation had overwhelmed his common sense. "I wasn't ready." Sarah studied him for a moment, reading the desperation in his posture, the way his hands trembled slightly with adrenaline and wounded pride. She had seen this before. The moment when ego overtook judgment. It was often the last mistake that certain types of men made. As you wish, she said quietly. This time, Jake abandoned all pretense of technique. His attacks became wild. Desperate attempts to land anything that might salvage his reputation. He threw combinations with reckless abandon, his perfect form deteriorating into crude brawling. It was exactly what Sarah had expected, and exactly what she had been trained to exploit. She began to systematically dismantle him. Every wild swing was redirected into empty air. Every desperate kick was caught and used against him. Sarah's movements became fluid, almost dance-like, as she demonstrated the difference between someone who had learned to fight in comfortable dojos and someone who had been forged in the crucible of actual warfare. The end came suddenly and decisively. Jake, exhausted from his flailing attacks, committed to a haymaker that left him completely exposed. Sarah stepped inside his guard, trapped his arm, and executed a throw that sent him crashing to the mat with enough force to drive the breath from his lungs. Before he could recover, she had secured a joint lock that could have shattered his elbow with the slightest additional pressure. "Yield," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent dojo. Jake's pride warred with the very real pain radiating from his trapped arm. Sarah's control was perfect. He was completely helpless, but she was applying just enough pressure to demonstrate her dominance without causing injury. Finally, gasping, he tapped out. Sarah released him immediately and stepped back, extending her hand to help him up. Jake stared at the offered hand for a long moment, his worldview crumbling around him. Everything he thought he knew about martial arts, about himself, about his own abilities, had been shattered in the space of a few minutes. He ignored her hand and struggled to his feet on his own, his face burning with shame. Around the dojo, students were openly staring, some recording with their phones, others whispering excitedly about what they had just witnessed. His reputation, carefully built over years of tournament victories and dojo politics, lay in ruins. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked at him for a moment, considering how to respond. She had already revealed more than she intended, attracted attention that could compromise her carefully maintained civilian identity. But something in Jake's expression, a genuine confusion that went beyond wounded pride, made her decide to offer a partial truth. "Someone who learned to fight in places where second place meant death," she replied quietly. Master Nakamura approached, his expression thoughtful. Throughout his career, he had encountered many exceptional martial artists. But Sarah was something different entirely. Her technique drew from multiple disciplines, but it was the seamless integration of methods that spoke of real-world application rather than dojo study. "Where did you train?" he asked respectfully. "I have never seen anything quite like your approach." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Various places. I've been fortunate to learn from many excellent instructors." It was a non-answer, but delivered with such quiet authority that further questions seemed inappropriate. Nakamura bowed slightly, recognizing that some secrets were not meant to be shared in public settings. Jake finally found his voice again. "I don't understand. You're not listed in any tournament rankings. I've never heard of you in any martial arts circles. How is it possible that someone with your skill level is completely unknown?" Sarah adjusted her gi, which remained perfectly neat despite the intensity of their encounter. "Not everyone who knows how to fight chooses to compete in tournaments," she replied. "Some of us learned for different reasons." The implications of her words settled over the dojo like a heavy blanket. Students began to murmur among themselves, speculating about Sarah's background. The possibilities ranged from military service to law enforcement to more exotic alternatives that seemed to belong more in movies than in a suburban martial arts academy. Derek, still trying to process his friend's complete defeat, stepped forward aggressively. "That's convenient. You show up here, destroy our best fighter, and then act all mysterious about your background. How do we know you're not just some kind of fraud?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sarah turned her attention to Derek with the same flat, predatory gaze that had preceded Jake's defeat. But this time, there was something darker in her expression, a hint of the violence that lay beneath her controlled exterior. Would you like a demonstration as well? She asked quietly. Derek's bravado evaporated instantly. Something in Sarah's voice, a tone that suggested violence was not just possible but imminent, made him take an involuntary step backward. The man who had been so eager to support Jake's challenge suddenly found himself very interested in examining his shoes. I thought not, Sarah said, her voice returning to its normal, conversational tone. Master Nakamura cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should return to the scheduled curriculum, he suggested. There is much we can all learn from what we have witnessed tonight. But Sarah was already walking toward the edge of the mat, collecting her water bottle and preparing to leave. The demonstration had gone far beyond what she had intended, and her instincts were telling her that it was time to extract herself from the situation before it escalated further. Leaving so soon? Jake asked, his voice cracking slightly. The seminar isn't over. Sarah paused at the edge of the mat and looked back at him. For just a moment, her expression softened, and Jake caught a glimpse of genuine sympathy in her eyes. You're a good martial artist, she said quietly. Your technique is solid, your conditioning is excellent, and your dedication is obvious. But you've been training for sport, not survival. There's a difference, and tonight you learned what that difference looks like. Jake opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah was already moving toward the door. As she reached the exit, Master Nakamura called after her. Will you be returning for future classes? He asked hopefully. Sarah paused, her hand on the door handle. Around the dojo, 60 pairs of eyes waited for her answer. She had come here for a simple training session, hoping to maintain her skills while living the quiet civilian life she had been promised after her last deployment. Instead, she had created a spectacle that would be talked about for months. I don't think that would be appropriate, she replied finally. Educational for everyone involved. Sometimes that's enough. And with that, she was gone, leaving behind a dojo full of stunned martial artists and one very humbled black belt who was beginning to understand that there were levels of combat expertise that existed far beyond anything he had ever imagined. The weeks following the incident at East Valley Martial Arts Academy took on a life of their own. Despite Sarah's hopes that the encounter would be quickly forgotten, the opposite occurred. Videos recorded by students spread through social media like wildfire, though the poor quality and multiple angles created more questions than answers. Local martial arts forums buzzed with speculation about the mysterious woman who had dominated both a renowned master and a respected black belt. Jake Morrison found himself at the center of unwanted attention. His defeat had been recorded from multiple angles, and despite his friends' attempts to control the narrative, the videos clearly showed his complete inability to handle Sarah's counterattacks. Tournament organizers began questioning his rankings. Training partners became less deferential, and his carefully constructed reputation crumbled piece by piece. 3 weeks after the incident, Jake sat in his apartment, scrolling through yet another forum discussion about the mysterious fighter. The comments were brutal, dissecting every aspect of his performance and speculating about Sarah's background. Some suggested she was a former Olympic athlete. Others theorized she had trained with special forces units. A few claimed she was obviously a fraud, who had gotten lucky against an overconfident opponent. The last theory stung the most because Jake knew it wasn't true. He had replayed the encounter countless times in his memory, analyzing every movement and counter. Sarah hadn't gotten lucky. She had demonstrated a level of skill that existed in an entirely different category from anything he had encountered in his martial arts journey. His doorbell rang, interrupting his brooding. Jake wasn't expecting anyone, and he considered ignoring it entirely. But the persistent ringing eventually forced him to answer. Standing in his doorway was Derek, holding a thick manila envelope and wearing an expression that Jake had never seen before. His friend looked simultaneously excited and deeply troubled. You need to see this, Derek said without preamble, pushing past Jake into the apartment. See what? Jake asked, closing the door behind him. Derek held up the envelope. I've been doing research on our mystery woman, Sarah Martinez. Took me 3 weeks of digging, calling in favors, and following paper trails. But I finally found something. Jake felt his stomach clench. Part of him wanted to forget the entire incident, to move on with his life and pretend it had never happened. But a larger part of him needed to know who had so completely destroyed his confidence. "What did you find?" he asked quietly. Derek opened the envelope and pulled out a series of printed documents. First, the basics. Sarah Elena Martinez, 28 years old, born in San Diego. Parents were both Navy, father was a SEAL, mother was Navy intelligence. Sarah enlisted immediately after high school. Jake took the documents, his hands trembling slightly. The top sheet showed a military personnel file, though most of the details were heavily redacted. Sarah's photograph stared back at him, but this version wore military dress blues and carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of a professional soldier. "Navy SEAL?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Derek shook his head. "That's just the beginning. She completed BUD/S training, that's basic underwater demolition. SEAL in record time. Top of her class in every category. But then it gets interesting." He pointed to a section of the file that was almost entirely blacked out. After her initial training, she was selected for something called the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Most of the details are classified, but from what I could piece together from public records and news reports, that's the unit that handles the most sensitive operations. Jake's hands were shaking now as he turned through the pages. The documents painted a picture of someone whose life had been dedicated to violence on a scale that made tournament fighting seem like children's games. "There's more," Derek continued, pulling out a newspaper clipping. "Remember that hostage situation in Somalia about 2 years ago? The one where terrorists took over that oil facility and threatened to execute American workers?" Jake nodded vaguely. He remembered seeing something about it on the news, but he hadn't paid much attention to international incidents. The official report says that Somali military forces conducted a successful rescue operation with minimal casualties. But if you dig deeper, if you look at the casualty reports and the timeline, it's clear that wasn't what happened. Derek spread out several more documents, including satellite imagery and intelligence reports that Jake couldn't understand how his friend had obtained. The facility was taken by a dozen heavily armed terrorists. They had automatic weapons, explosives, and defensive positions. According to the official story, local forces staged a complex multi-hour assault, but the real timeline shows something different. He pointed to a timestamp on one of the documents. The attack began here, at 0347 local time. By 0352, it was over. 5 minutes. 12 armed terrorists, neutralized in 5 minutes by what the report describes as a single-person reconnaissance element that happened to be in the area. Jake stared at the documents, trying to process what Derek was telling him. "You're saying Sarah was involved in this?" "I'm saying that someone with her exact skill set and unit assignment was in that exact location at that exact time, and 12 professional killers were eliminated in hand-to-hand combat before they could harm any hostages." Derek pulled out another set of papers. "Then there's this. Syria. 14 months ago. A chemical weapons facility was supposed to be destroyed by airstrike, but the intelligence was wrong. American aid workers were being held there as human shields." Jake looked at the aerial photographs, showing a bombed-out complex surrounded by desert. "What does this have to do with Sarah?" The airstrike was called off at the last minute because of the hostages, but somehow, the facility was still destroyed from the inside, and the aid workers were found safe at an extraction point 12 miles away. The official report credits local resistance fighters, but the forensic evidence tells a different story. Derek pointed to details in the photographs that meant nothing to Jake but obviously carried significance for his friend. The explosives were placed with surgical precision. The guards were eliminated with techniques consistent with advanced special operations training, and there were witnesses who described seeing a small woman in tactical gear in the area around the time of the operation. Jake set down the documents and walked to his window, staring out at the peaceful suburban street where his greatest concern had been maintaining his tournament ranking. The disconnect between his world and the reality Derek was describing felt overwhelming. "How do you know all this?" he asked finally. "Where did you get classified military documents?" Derek's expression became uncomfortable. My cousin works for a defense contractor. He has access to certain databases, and he owed me a favor. Most of this information isn't classified anymore, just buried in bureaucratic archives that nobody bothers to read. Jake turned back to face his friend. Why does any of this matter? So, she's military special forces. That explains why she's good at fighting. Why did you need to dig into her background like this? Derek's excitement returned. Because there's one more thing. The most important thing. He pulled out a final document. This one more recent than the others. It was a medical discharge form, dated just 4 months ago. Sarah Martinez was medically retired from active duty following a training accident that left her with what the military classifies as permanent partial disability. According to her service record, she can no longer meet the physical requirements for special operations duty. Jake stared at the document. She's disabled? Officially, yes. The records indicate nerve damage in her left leg that affects her mobility and reaction time. She's receiving full military disability benefits and has been classified as unfit for combat duty. The implications crashed over Jake like a physical blow. The woman who had effortlessly destroyed him, who had demonstrated combat skills that belonged in action movies rather than suburban dojos, had been fighting with a permanent disability. What he had thought was her full capability was actually her reduced, compromised performance. You're telling me, Jake said slowly, that when she dominated me, when she made me look like a complete amateur, she was operating at less than full capacity? Derek nodded grimly. According to these documents, Sarah Martinez at 100% was considered one of the most dangerous human beings on the planet. What you fought was Sarah Martinez at maybe 70%, dealing with chronic pain and reduced mobility. Jake sank into his chair, the full weight of his humiliation settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had spent years building his confidence, accumulating belts and trophies, and the respect of his peers. In a matter of minutes, a woman fighting through a disability had reduced all of that to nothing. But as he sat there processing Derek's research, Jake began to understand something that had been nagging at him since the night at the dojo. Sarah hadn't been cruel. She could have hurt him badly, could have humiliated him even more completely than she had. Instead, she had used just enough force to make her point, then tried to offer him a graceful way to accept defeat. There's something else, Derek said quietly. I found her current address. Jake looked up sharply. What? She lives about 20 minutes from here. Small apartment complex, nothing fancy. I was thinking maybe we could... No, Jake said firmly. Absolutely not. Derek looked surprised. Don't you want to talk to her? To understand what happened that night? Jake stood up and walked back to the window. Outside, children were playing in the street, their biggest concern being home before dinner. It was a world away from the reality that Sarah Martinez had inhabited, a reality where mistakes meant death and second place meant never coming home. What would be the point? Jake asked. To apologize for challenging someone who could have killed me without breaking a sweat? To thank her for showing restraint when she had every right to put me in the hospital? Derek gathered up the documents, clearly frustrated by Jake's response. Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. Even the score? Derek. She spent her career hunting the most dangerous people on the planet. She fought terrorists in places where backup was 1,000 miles away. And she did it while wounded, while dealing with injuries that would sideline most people permanently. He turned back to face his friend. There is no evening the score. There never was. I was playing martial arts. She was a professional killer trying to live a normal life. The only reason I'm not permanently damaged is because she chose to show mercy to an arrogant fool. Derek stared at him for a moment, then began putting the documents back in the envelope. So that's it? You're just going to accept being humiliated? I'm going to accept reality, Jake replied. That night at the dojo taught me something important about the difference between fighting as a hobby and fighting for survival. Sarah Martinez spent her life in situations where hesitation meant death. I've spent my life in air-conditioned gyms with referees and rules. He walked over to his collection of tournament trophies, awards that had once filled him with pride but now seemed somehow smaller. I'm good at martial arts. I might even be very good at martial arts. But I'm not a warrior. And pretending otherwise almost got me seriously hurt. Derek shook his head in disgust. You've lost your edge, man. She broke your confidence, and now you're making excuses for her. Jake smiled for the first time since the encounter. No, Derek. She gave me perspective. For the first time in years, I know exactly where I stand and what my limitations are. That's not a weakness. It's the beginning of real strength. After Derek left, Jake sat alone with his thoughts for a long time. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the videos of his defeat one more time. But now he was watching with different eyes. Instead of seeing his humiliation, he began to understand the masterclass in combat that Sarah had provided. Every movement she made had been purposeful, economical, and devastatingly effective. She had read his intentions before he acted, controlled the distance and timing of every exchange, and demonstrated levels of skill that belonged in an entirely different category from anything he had previously experienced. But more importantly, she had shown restraint. Despite his arrogance, his disrespect, and his public challenge, she had used only enough force to make her point. In her world, he realized, enemies didn't get second chances. The fact that he had walked away uninjured was a gift he was only beginning to appreciate. Jake picked up his phone and began typing a message, then stopped. What could he possibly say to someone who had lived the life Sarah had lived? How could he express gratitude for a lesson that had shattered his ego but ultimately made him a better martial artist? Instead, he opened his laptop and began researching military support organizations. If Sarah Martinez was dealing with a service-connected disability while trying to build a civilian life, the least he could do was contribute to organizations that helped veterans make that transition. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small way of acknowledging the debt he owed to a woman who had given him the gift of humility and the understanding that true strength wasn't about defeating others, it was about knowing yourself, your limitations, and the difference between sport and survival. Outside his window, the suburban street remained peaceful. Children still played their games, and life continued in the comfortable bubble of civilian safety. But Jake Morrison now understood that this peace was protected by people like Sarah Martinez, warriors who had sacrificed pieces of themselves so that others could live without fear. He would never be what she was, and that was okay. He would never face the challenges she had faced, and that was a privilege he had never recognized. But he could be better than he was, could approach his training with the humility and respect that real combat demanded. The trophies on his shelf caught the evening light, and for the first time in weeks, Jake felt something other than shame when he looked at them. They represented a journey, a commitment to improvement, and the foundation for whatever came next. They weren't meaningless, but they weren't everything either. Tomorrow, he would return to the dojo. He would train harder, with more focus and less ego. He would remember the lesson that Sarah Martinez had taught him, that true mastery wasn't about defeating others, but about understanding yourself and respecting the profound difference between sport and survival. And if he was very lucky, someday he might have the chance to thank her properly for the gift of that understanding.